Islamophobia, from my perspective, and certainly from the perspective of many in the Muslim community, is essentially anti-Muslim hatred. Fear and hatred, it's akin to the most virulent forms of racism. It also has many of the aspects and forms of anti-Semitism. And if you think of the historic context and where Islamophobia has stemmed from, you can look back to the Middle Ages, to the period when Europe was first encountering Islam, and Europeans were trying to understand what is this religion, who are these Muslims, and there was a branch of, if you like, science, if you like, called Orientalism, which basically portrayed Islam and Muslims as essentially antithetical to Christianity, antithetical to Western, I don't know if they had that term back then, but certainly to European values, and perpetuated stereotypes and outright lies, demonizing the religion of Islam and Muslims. And I think the impact of Orientalism wasn't limited just to the Middle Ages. It has continued on, and a lot of the stereotypes and narratives surrounding Islam and Muslims today actually have their roots in Orientalist thinking. And so Islamophobia is essentially fear and hatred of Muslims, and it can lead to marginalization, and it does lead to marginalization. It does lead to distrust. It does lead to violence, and we've seen that. We've seen that very recently and very tragically. Where has this hatred of Islam and Muslims and these stereotypes stemmed from? They're not a recent phenomenon. They date back many, many, many centuries. And unfortunately, Orientalism is still a branch of academic pursuits. So you still have Orientalists who subscribe to those theories, and they are still spreading these false notions of Islam and Muslims. I also think that Islam is, because it is a comprehensive way of life and worldview, people see it as more than just private worship and private practice. And I think that also creates an issue. The being Muslim has many aspects to it, many aspects to identity. And it's hard to separate that from your public identity and your public presence. And a lot of people actually see that as a threat to Christianity or Western civilization. People talk about values and how, Islamic values or Muslim values are somehow contradictory to Western values. And that's not true. In fact, a lot of the values of Islam are universal. In fact, they are universal values that we should all subscribe to, regardless of your creed, regardless of your nationality, ethnic origin. But that's another cause. And I also think that, unfortunately, events over the last few decades in terms of wars, civil strife, the actions of particular groups, criminal groups, terrorist groups, it's been very easy to basically lump all Muslims in the same bucket. Attacks in the West as well, perpetuated by these groups, create fear, obviously, and irrational, hatred, if you like, of anything to do with Muslims and Islam. Fundamental ignorance, I think, as well. I think generally the population is very ignorant about Islam and Muslims. People have a view of, for example, what happens in mosques, which is completely different to the actual reality of mosques. And if people understood how important mosques are and how much of a force of good, not just within the Muslim community, but in the broader society, people have a very different view towards mosques. And sadly, the media has played a very, very big role in perpetuating some of these stereotypes, sensationalizing demonizing, spreading some of these false narratives, giving airtime to people who are saying these hateful things. And finally, our politicians. It is fair to say that some of the worst offenders in terms of Islamophobic speech are politicians. They're supposed to be our leaders. And so when they start doing that, they are mainstreaming some of these very hateful lies and stereotypes. And so they make it much more acceptable and accessible to the general public. Some of the white supremacists, far-right, neo-Nazi, extreme fascist groups, one thing they all have in common is this deep, abiding hatred of Islam and Muslims. They also hate other groups, but one thing that unites them all is this incredible hatred towards Islam and Muslims. And we've seen them very active online and also in the physical domain in terms of attacks on Muslims in Europe, North America, in Australia, and tragically in New Zealand last year. And the person, the mass murderer, the terrorist that committed that atrocity in Christchurch was espousing many of these falsehoods, these lies, these stereotypes to describe Muslims and Islam, to justify his actions. The impact is enormous. I won't speak about the global impact, but you can see that. I'll just touch on the fact that what's happening in Australia is not unique or isolated. We can't lose sight of the fact that it all happens in a global context. But certainly in Australia, I mean, Muslims have been targeted. Muslim women and children, in particular, being the most vulnerable, have been viciously attacked. Mosques have been damaged, and Muslims have been made to feel unwelcome. Muslims have been made to feel that they are inferior, that they don't have the same rights as other Australian citizens, even if they've been born here, and even if they've been born here to parents that were born here as well. And many generations of Muslims, they're made to feel not Australian. They're made to feel distrusted, and they're made to feel suspect. And Muslim identity, unfortunately, has been criminalized. And if you're a Muslim, you sit somewhere on a spectrum. Either you're no threat, we like you because you're exactly like us, we can't tell the difference, to all the way through to you look too Muslim, you act too Muslim, and so you are suspect, if not worse, you are someone who's potentially a terrorist or a criminal. Very difficult to navigate that, and it's unfair and unreasonable. No other community really has been placed in that position. And Muslim youth in particular are suffering because not only are they having to deal with the normal travails of going through, teenage years and young adult time, the young adult period, and grappling with their identity, but they're also caught in the two worlds, and they don't feel they belong here, they belong there, and a lot of Muslim youth are really suffering as a result.